Hello ladies and gentlemen, this is Blue Maxima. Welcome back to Blue Boards. This time we're going to be taking a look at the two small box expansions for Aeon's End. And they are the Depths, which is on the left, and the Nameless, which is on the right. And I will say that the one thing that I really like about these expansions is that there's no fuss, there's no muss, there's no having to actively learn new rules for these expansions. There's no actively having to change up the way the game works significantly. It's literally just take the stuff out of the boxes, put it in the right slots in the big box, and just go. You're done. And you can pick out the different nemesis, the breach mages, the market cards, and just go anytime you like. To the point where they even include new card dividers so that it's nice and easy to just stick them into the box and just go. You're done. And I really do appreciate that. I know there's something to be said about expansions adding, more depth to the rules, new parts of the game, what have you. But for a game like this, which doesn't really need it, having all of this just be like, hey, just chuck it in the box and pull it out when you want and you're done, it's good stuff. So I'm not going to argue against that. With that said, let's slide the camera over to the left and talk about the first expansion I got, the Depths. So the Depths has 3 new breach mages, 8 new market cards, and 1 new nemesis in the form of the Horde Crone. Now, the market cards are probably my favorite part of the expansion because they all have some really cool uses and they just add some variety to building the market out, to making things interesting, to finding new potential card combos. And I really do like that, and it's the part of the expansion I most appreciate because admittedly, the breach mages in this one aren't exactly what I would call my favorites. They do have some pretty neat abilities, like for example Nim being able to discard the top card of the Nemesis deck to run it out a bit faster and to try and get a sort of deck out win on the Nemesis, which is really hard, but not impossible. And then you've got Reeve, who can do like 8 damage to do different minions for 8 crystals or 4 charges, which isn't too bad. But Jana only having the ability to give Gravehold 7 life and missing a breach to begin with is a bit rough. She doesn't seem like she's really worth it to use over a bunch of other ones who are just more useful in the grander scheme of things. And their starter cards don't do that much to change them up from, being mainly about the breaches they have open and their special abilities on top of that. So it isn't the best set of breach mages, I'll grant you, but it's entirely possible there's a bunch of really cool strategies with them that I haven't seen or figured out yet, and I'm just flat out wrong about that. And I'm pretty open to that. Not a problem with that whatsoever. And the thing about the expansions that I like the most is adding the new nemesis. And for this example, we have the Horde Crone. The Horde Crone actually has a neat little take on the Carapace Queen's thing. The Carapace Queen, if you don't remember from my Aeon's End video, slowly builds up husks, and the more of these husks it gets, changes the ability it gets when it swarms. Well, these guys are a slightly different take on the subject. This is its own unique deck called the Trog deck that shows up in the game itself during setup, and as the game goes along, you'll be adding more and more of these Trog to the playing field. And when multiple of the same kind come out, they'll do some special effects. Like, for example, the Orps absolutely hate Gravehold and will hurt them all the time. The Yuds hate players and will hurt them all the time. And the Zombs do a little bit of everything. They hurt players, they hurt Gravehold, and they make players discard cards, which can be an absolute pain in the neck. And so the idea is focusing on these guys and thinning them out so that when a new one comes out, it means that it doesn't absolutely flatten Gravehold or one of the breach mages. And I don't mind this concept. I do enjoy fighting the Nemesis, but it does feel like a take on the Carapace Queen. It does feel like just a different approach to that concept, and it isn't the worst thing in the world. And it does build up pretty naturally. So here are the cards that you add to the Nemesis deck as you go, but the absolute majority of them are just add Trogs to the playing field and then potentially use another Trog again, or discard a Trog in play, or unleash 4 times and discard 2 Trogs in play. So you get 4 new ones out, but you get to get rid of 2 of them, which is absolutely painful. You should absolutely get rid of that. And even ones that'll pretend to be them. But once you get down to tier 3, it's like, hey, put 2 Trogs out, then do their effects twice. Hey, immediately put 2 more Trogs into play, and then keep putting 2 more Trogs into play every time the villain gets a turn. And then, hey, if there are less than 3 Trogs in play, get 4 Trogs in play. It's ridiculous how much it slowly builds up and starts becoming a bit more of a bloody stampede of Trogs. And it's just, it is a cool fight. Trying not to get overwhelmed by the Trogs is as interesting as trying to fight off the husks, but again, you just can't help but feel like this concept has been done before, and it's not a big enough change to the concept for me to say it's entirely original, but it's still a fun fight. I lost. If you couldn't guess. Trust me, I lost against every new nemesis you're going to see in this video. The Depths isn't that bad of an expansion. It's not the one that I would pick over the 2 of these, but it's still a decent enough expansion nonetheless. The new market cards add variety, especially since there's 8 of them to give you that little bit of extra kick. The Horde Crone is a fun fight, and I'd argue the weakest part is the 3 Breach Mages because they're not massively interesting. Maybe running down the Nemesis deck a fair bit, but not entirely. We'll just say that much. With that said, let's move over to the other expansion, which is the Nameless. The Nameless has 2 new Nemesis, 1 new Breach Mage, and 7 new market cards. The market cards in this one are a little bit more complex, but they're all still pretty good. They add that little bit of extra variety, those extra powers. They are all extremely expensive, but they're all pretty neat. They all do the job, and therefore it's worth picking up the expansion for them, just because it gives you that little bit more variety, those extra combos, and everything that comes with having more spells, relics, and gems in the game. So Malastare ends up being the most interesting Breach Mage of the 4, actually, because his ability is kind of ridiculous. Gain a spell from any supply pile, and then immediately put it in any player's opened breach. Which is ridiculous. Get any spell you want and put it into someone else's breach. So if someone else is about to take a turn, you think one of these effects is going to be useful, just do that. Boom, attack, done. It costs 12 crystals, which is kind of ridiculous, but at the same time, Malastare actually starts with 9 crystals in his opening hand and deck, so he's not going to have any problems getting those breaches open, focusing them down in order to get them opened up. Things along those lines to make things just that little bit easier for him. And so as a result, he ends up being a really interesting mage to play, even if it means that you kind of have to rely on that really high crystal generation to get anything done. And if you're a bad randomizer like me, sometimes it'll just end up in you dying anyway. But yeah, that kind of happens when you use randomizers. And now we move on to the 2 Nemesis. So we'll start with the least interesting one, which is the Blight Lord. Now, I'll just put that there so you can see it nice and clearly. Actually, I'll leave that there. Probably easier to just zoom in and do a fancy little side-by-side with it. So the Blight Lord is arguably the least interesting of the 2. Like how the Horde Crone is a take on the Carapace Queen, the Blight Lord is kind of a take on the Crooked Mask. So he's got what is called Tainted Jades, and these will get added to your hand or to your deck or what have you whenever he decides to unleash or use a specific attack ability. And these Tainted Jades can give you money in exchange for damage, or you can spend money to destroy it. But it also kind of turns out like the corruption in the Crooked Mask fight, because there is a track down here. And if there are 2 or less of these in the pile, actually is it 1 or less of these? It's on the thing. When this pile starts to run out, the corruption track will slowly start moving up. And if it gets all the way to the end, the players will lose. And there are points where the track can jump forward 2 spaces. So it's really easy to get that corruption track into a spot that you can't backtrack from. So you really do need to focus on whether or not it's worth getting the Tainted Jades out of the way, or worth actually using them to stock up on spells in order to actually fight the Blight Lord off. And most of the cards that get added to the Nemesis deck are along the lines of either advancing the Tainted track, getting Tainted Jades, or both at the same time. So it's nothing particularly interesting. It doesn't change up the game that much, and it is kind of, but not massively, a take on another kind of Nemesis. It's still fun to fight, don't get me wrong. It is different enough to be its own challenge, but I still feel like it's just a slight too much like the corruption that comes from the Crooked Mask. However, the hardest Nemesis in the game, and arguably my favorite part of these two expansions, is the Wayward One. So you have a different track to work with on this guy. It starts at 1, and it has the opportunity to move to 2, 3, 4, and then loop back around to 1. Any spell that is currently in the breach that is alongside where the marker is counts as aligned and does full damage. Anything that's in any other breach is misaligned and does half damage. So, it can be really annoying when you've got 4 breaches open, a bunch of spells, and only one is going to do full damage. It's going to be a pain. And so as a result, it actively changes up the way you think about spells, because a lot of the spells in this game often result to, if you've got 4 spells in your hand and 4 open breaches, just fill them all up and ask questions later. This changes that up massively, to the point where you think, oh, am I going to be misaligned next turn? Am I going to be aligned next turn? And it keeps your brain going. It adds a new layer of strategy to the game, and it's an entirely unique take on the idea of the Nemesis. And what helps it out are the cards that get added to the Nemesis deck. So we have here, let's say for example, the Blinking Terror. It's assigned to 3. Any player loses a charge or suffers 2 damage. That's fine. Any player discards a misaligned prep spell. Fair enough. If a player has an aligned spell, a player with an aligned spell suffers 5 damage. So here you are thinking to yourself, oh good lord, what am I going to do about that? I've got a spell on 3, I'm currently aligned, I'm going to take a massive sock to the face. And it just keeps going like that too. The player with the most misaligned prep spell suffers 3 damage and discards 2 cards. Oof. Shift Wayward 1 to 4, Gravehold suffers 8 damage, and you may collectively discard up to 2 aligned spells. So you need to have spells in 4 in order to avoid this problem. Although it takes 2 turns to set off, it is admittedly a bit of a bastard when it comes up. Because it's like, hey, we need to put spells out there, we need to hang on to them, and we need to decide when it's most worth using. But there is one card in this that makes it arguably the hardest fight in the game. The Nether Spawn. This minion is aligned to 2. Prevent all damage dealt to Wayward 1. Persistent, so once per turn, any player destroys a breach. So you're slowly going to be losing breaches. They're going to be misaligned, so you're going to be having trouble taking out the Nether Spawn in the first place with that 15 bloody health he's got, and Gravehold's going to be taking damage in the background. This is an incredibly rough card. If you manage to get to tier 3 of Wayward 1, you are going to see this guy, and he's going to wipe the floor with you. Guess how I lost? I wasn't doing very well to begin with, but when he came out, it was like, oh, I am so screwed. I am genuinely screwed. And in my defense, I was. So I lost to all of these guys, but they were all fun. Using all the breach mages was still all fun, even if some were less effective than others. And using all of the new market cards was just way more fun as well. Just adding that little bit of extra variety, those little bit of extra combos, and the fact that it all just goes straight in the box, it all fits, and you can basically just say, okay, pull them out whenever you decide you want them to, makes these 2 expansions worth getting. If you had to pick one of the 2, I'd definitely pick the Nameless over the Depths, but they are both worth owning just for the extra variety, if you can afford both of them. And with that said, that wraps up the entirety of the first wave of Aeon's End. So the first big box, which is of course Aeon's End, and these 2 expansions here consist of the first wave, and the second wave starts with War Eternal. Will we be checking out War Eternal? I mean, I've got one of the expansions for it right here. If that doesn't answer your question, I don't know what will. But I am enjoying the hell out of this series. It is a genuinely great take on deck building, and these expansions just add more. and more in a way that doesn't break the game rules, that doesn't massively change things up to the point where I have to remember a bunch of extra rules. It's just all stuff you throw in the box, pull out when you want it, and have fun. Good stuff. Well worth the purchase. Although again, if you have to pick one, pick the Nameless. This has been Blue Maxima. I'll see you all next time.